I've been using the Treatex range of hard wax oils for years now on my furniture products. I don't even know why I started using it. I've tried a few others and I just really liked it. It's got a great range of colours and other things. So I was really pleased that Timbecon has started selling it because it means I can just get it a whole lot easier. But I thought I'd go through some of the benefits of hard wax oil. Maybe you've used it before, maybe you haven't. I'll have some tips that might help you along the way. Or if you're just starting out, some useful information to get your best bang for your buck and get a really good finish on your furniture that you're making. It's good to kind of know what a hard wax is and where it comes from. I mean, obviously it is a wax product, so it's got it in the name. It's a combination of natural oils and natural waxes. And the way it kind of works is the oil component really soaks into the timber, penetrates in, protects it, carries some of that wax in with it, and the wax and the rest of the finish actually leaves a really nice hard finish on the surface of the timber. And it's a finish that actually hardens over time. It kind of stemmed from really traditional finishes where woodworkers would first apply linseed oil, that would penetrate into the timber, and then they'd apply beeswax over the top and try and get a really nice sheen. But the beeswax was really soft and it was just a tricky two-part process, and this kind of puts it all together into one really useful product. I really like hard wax oil for a number of reasons over some of the other products. I mean, I also use something like Danish oil quite a lot if I want a really, really soft finish that doesn't actually leave a lot of coat on the surface of the timber at all. Hard wax, on the other hand, does build up a bit of surface, which means you've got much greater timber protection than you would from a penetrating oil like Danish oil. So if I'm doing dining tables, bathroom vanities, anywhere that's going to have a lot of water exposure or possibly risk of staining from food and wine and stuff, hard wax is 100% the way to go because it resists those stains better than something like a softer finish like a Danish oil might do. On the other hand, really, really protective finishes like polyurethane and varnish, they actually leave a much thicker, sometimes harder coat on the surface of the timber. And for some applications that can be good. It's not the kind of finish that I tend to lean towards. And one of the reasons is that really hard coat on the surface of the timber doesn't actually bond as well to the timber as something like a hard wax does, because a polyurethane or a varnish, it's not really penetrating very far into the timber and not creating that really strong bond. So sometimes in like a wet area application like a bathroom, if you've got a really nice polyurethane finish and something's happened to leave some raw timber exposed, water will get under there and it will damage the bond between the surface and the timber itself, and you'll end up lifting that finish, which will look terrible. Water will get under there, it'll stain the timber. And then to fix it, you've got to sand it all completely back to bare timber. And that's where something like this is really good because it's way less scary. It's a finish that actually does allow a little bit of moisture and air to pass through the finish. It's porous in that way, but because it's truly bonded to the timber and penetrates in, there's no way that water can kind of sneak beneath there and lift that finish up. So it means that if it does get really stained, which it's pretty hard to do, but if something happens to it or you get a big scratch, you can actually just apply a little bit more without having to fully sand it back to bare timber and start again. Another really important thing about hard wax oil, especially this Treatex one, is it's a really natural product. So it's a blend of a whole bunch of natural oils and waxes, and they're actually blended in with like a medical grade alcohol solution. So it's really safe to use on all kinds of surfaces that you might have food or where your kids are playing. It's not going to be off-gassing a whole bunch of turpentine because that's not in the mix at all. It doesn't smell strong when you apply it. And another really fantastic thing about this newest, the Evolution product of the Treatex range, which is kind of their latest product, is it's completely non-flammable. So again, that's safer, also makes transport safer, but ultimately it just makes it less harmful to apply and a really safe product to use on really nice pieces of furniture for your family. So the actual hard wax oil product that I'm using today is called Evolution by Whittle Waxes. So Whittle Wax is an Australian company that started bringing in hard wax oils into Australia. It was one of the first companies that ever did. And the first hard wax oil that they brought in, as far as I know, was the Tretex product, which is made by a factory in Germany. Now, the Tretex factory has also started making this Evolution product for Whittle Waxes, and it has a few differences from the original Tretex range. As I've mentioned earlier, the main difference between this and the original Tretex product is this is non-flammable. A couple of the other things that is different between these two products: you get a higher coverage with the Evolution than you did with Tretex. So Tretex was roughly 20 square meters per litre. This is roughly 30, so it's a lot more coverage, which means it's a more economical product to use. It also does penetrate a little bit deeper into the timber, which is really good in terms of the bond that you're creating. It also means that you get a slightly lower level of film build on the timber, which means a more natural, less thick finish as a result. So that's just something to keep in mind. Less like a polyurethane, and yeah, really good penetration. So the Evolution comes in 4 sheen levels. Generally, the one I like the best is called Luster. It's kind of just up from matte, and then there's a glossy one, and I think this one at the moment is a satin. The satin it's really mild, it's not a high gloss at all, and the luster is just a little bit lower than that. Also has all of these great colours, which I've done a whole bunch of demos here, and we'll talk about some of the tips and tricks for applying these colours and getting really good results. Applying this stuff is really easy. You can use almost anything, so a brush or a roller or a rag. I've actually really been enjoying using these little non-scratch scouring pads, especially for the first coat. What they do is they hold a small amount of product like a paintbrush will, but because you can drag them over the surface with some pressure, it allows you to leave a really nice even but thin film. Traditionally, when I would apply something like Danish oil, I would apply it to the timber and then I'd wipe it all off, and then whatever's left on the cloth is just wastage. And with a slightly more expensive product like this, I'm reluctant to waste a whole bunch of product on the cloth, and using a product like this scourer means that you're not actually wasting a whole bunch of hard wax oil in the application, because you can then transfer that over to the next piece of timber. After you've applied your first coat, you need to make sure to let that coat dry. I normally leave 24 hours, and that way I know that it's really nice and dry, and then I give it a really light sand before I put on the next coat. So if I'm using sandpaper, I'll use 220, 240 grit or higher, something like that. And it's just a really light sand. We're only trying to just barely knock off any little dust particles or anything that might have settled on the surface. Otherwise, you can use non-scratch white Scotch-Brite. Also works pretty well, just to take down any imperfections before you apply the second coat. I like to apply the second coat with a nice brush. Gives me a really nice finish. But if I'm doing a huge table or something, I'll usually just apply it with a roller, and that works fine. The Evolution range also has a whole bunch of stains. I think there's about 10 colours, plus 2 more natural colours. Now, you don't mix these in with your first or second coat of hard wax. You actually apply these first. Now, these are actually just the same hard wax with some pigment added. But the reason that you don't tend to mix them into your later coats is that if you have this colour right on the surface of the timber, and then you apply 2 coats of hard wax on top of that, it's really setting that colour and protecting it. Whereas if you're adding this colour into your actual hard wax layers, over time, as those hard wax layers might get worn down, for instance if it was a floor, the colour would go with it. Whereas if this is underneath those 2 layers, it really protects that colour, which means you'll get a more consistent colour over your piece of furniture or your floor for a longer period of time. Applying these is pretty simple. You want to make sure that you've got really good coverage, work it into the timber, and then wipe all excess off. So, with a nice clean cloth, buff it off until you've got a really nice even coverage, but you're not leaving a whole bunch of wet spots of stain behind. You let that dry just like you would a normal coat of hard wax oil, and then you can apply your first and second coat of actual hard wax finish on top of that. Don't do any sanding after your first colour coat, because you don't want to knock any of that colour back. So you can sand between your first and second actual hard wax coats, but not on your first colour coat. Some other really important tips when using this colour range to get a really good consistent finish is about how you sand. Now, the temptation when doing this is to sand really nice and fine so that you have a perfectly smooth piece before you apply any finish. But in this case, If you sand any finer than about 150, it tends to close off the pores of the timber too much, and you don't get a really nice consistent color adhesion to the wood. So I found that a 120 grit on my random orbital sander gave a pretty good even result, but if I wanted a really strong color adhesion, a 120 grit hand sanded with the grain actually opened those pores up a little bit more and gave me a much more even finish and also a much deeper color. Another thing to consider is if you're looking for an even deeper color than that, hand sand with 120 with the grain, get rid of some of that dust, then get a damp cloth and wipe it over the surface of the timber. What the water does is actually opens up the pores in the timber again, let that dry, and then you apply your finish, and you'll get a much deeper set of that color across the whole range. So that's really important to know if you're trying to get more from these stains. If you're trying to get a really subtle effect, then just sand normally. Don't worry about opening up those pores using water, and don't worry about hand sanding for a slightly rougher finish than you might get from your random orbital sander. The last two products in this color range is this natural stain and raw stain light. And what these actually are is it's a lightning stain, but it's very mild. And it's used to apply to timber, especially lighter timbers like American oak or Vic ash, that you want it to retain a natural feel. You don't want the darkening effect that applying any sort of hard wax or varnish has on the timber. So you use these in the same way that you'd use any of these other finishes. So, sand to 120, then apply and then wipe off. But it doesn't actually leave very much pigment on there at all. The effect that it has is that when you then apply the hard wax oil over that, you don't get that timber darkening that you would if you hadn't applied these. These two natural stains are very similar. So there's natural and raw light. The only difference is that the natural has a little bit more coverage. So it has a little bit more white pigment essentially. It has more pigmentation on the timber. So the light is just a less intense version of that. And they both work really well. So it's worth experimenting with those if you're looking for the kind of finish where you'd like your American oak table to look like it hasn't really had anything applied to it at all. Just like a really nice subtle finish. So when that's used in conjunction with, say, a matte Evolution Hardwax, it almost looks like there's nothing on there at all, but the timber is really well protected and it will stay that same color and it won't get stained, and yeah, just a really nice effect. I've got a whole bunch of samples here, and we'll just go through some of the colors and the effects of different sanding methods and popping the grain with water like I talked about. I want to start by talking about these Whittle Waxes raw stains and the raw light stain that I mentioned earlier. So this piece here is a piece of American oak which has had just 2 coats of standard Evolution applied to it with no color at all. And then this one here has had the raw light applied to it before those 2 coats of Evolution. So you can see that it is a lighter color. It's very mild, so it's not a really deep effect. But if you can compare this one to the actual unstained side of the American oak, you'll notice that they're much more similar. So the Evolution range by itself does darken the timber slightly, but by using this raw light, it has maintained that more natural color of the American oak. You can see exactly the same thing with the Vic ash. This piece here has had 2 coats of just standard Whittle Wax Evolution Hardwax oil, and then this piece here has had the raw light stain added before those 2 coats. And again, you can see that this piece here looks actually more similar to the untreated piece of Vic ash than the treated one. So it's a really useful effect to be able to just maintain that natural look on a whole range of lighter timbers. These 2 pieces of American oak have both had the Evolution white stain added to them. They call it an Oryx white. Same timber, same stain, but you'll notice that they look quite different. The reason for that is this one here, which is a lot whiter, was, for one thing, it was hand sanded to 120 with the grain to slightly roughen the surface. And the second thing was I added a damp cloth afterwards to pop that grain, open those pores out so that it would absorb a little bit more of that white stain. Now, if you're looking for that even white effect, but you want it a little bit less white, and this goes for all of these stains by Evolution, you can actually dilute them with the Evolution product itself. So if you wanted to use, one of their reds or one of their browns, but you're finding it too intense, you can dilute it a little bit with this traditional hard wax oil. Here's another piece of American oak, and I added the black stain to this. On one side, on this first side, I hand sanded and opened the grain pores using water, and you'll see it's quite dark and even. On this other side, I just sanded with a random orbital sander, and you'll see that you've got really dark lines where the softer grain has absorbed the stain, but the harder, more denser areas haven't as much. So that's the advantage of knowing what the effects of sanding and opening the grain have on the actual absorption of the stain in order to get the best result for what you're trying to achieve. I actually really enjoyed doing all of these and seeing the effect that had on the timber. You can get really good results. Just do some test pieces first with the timber that you're using, experiment with different sanding techniques and whether or not you're opening the grain out with water. Make sure you're wiping off all the excess, let it dry. Add the rest of your Evolution Hardwax Oil on and you'll get a great finish. I've been using the Whittle Wax Hardwax for a long time now, and so I was really pleased to get to demonstrate this Evolution product, the newest product that they're making. I think it's well worth it. It costs a little bit more than maybe something like a Danish oil or a cheap varnish, but you get such a good result. It's really easy to apply. The range of colors are great. You've spent a lot of time making a nice piece of furniture, and there's no point skimping on cheap finish that isn't going to really showcase the piece that you've made. There'll be a link below to pick it up at Timbecon on their website. Otherwise, jump on and like this video and subscribe to the channel, and there'll be a whole bunch more of these coming along.